The press conference had been planned as just another routine political event, a chance for Usha Vance, the wife of Vice President J.D. Vance, to speak about her initiatives related to child welfare and education. But in the highly charged world of modern American politics, nothing ever remained routine for long. Inside the Grand Hall of the National Press Club in Washington, reporters were seated in neat rows, cameras flashing as Usha, poised and graceful in a navy blue dress, took her place behind the podium. She smiled politely, the very picture of calmness, as she adjusted the microphone. "Good afternoon, everyone," she began. "I want to thank you all for being here today. It's an honor to speak about the work we are doing to ensure a brighter future for America's children." The room was quiet, but the anticipation in the air was palpable. The event had drawn media attention for one reason. Usha Vance, an accomplished attorney and the first Indian-American wife of a sitting vice president, had become a figure of growing interest. Not just for her intellect, but for what she symbolized in America's ever-evolving political landscape. And then the question came. The journalist, a liberal-leaning, well-known commentator from a major network, stood up, a smirk tugging at the corners of her lips. She didn't even bother hiding the condescension in her voice. "You are an immigrant," she stated rather than asked, her tone sharp. "Do you ever feel out of place, married to the Vice President of the United States, a man who represents so many conservative values? Do you think you really belong in this administration?" A stunned hush fell over the room. Some reporters exchanged uneasy glances, others perked up, sensing a moment that would dominate the evening news cycle. For a split second, Usha simply stared at the journalist, her dark eyes calm, unwavering. Then she leaned slightly forward, gripping the podium. "Would you like to rephrase that?" she asked, her voice cool but firm. The journalist blinked, momentarily thrown off. She hadn't expected Usha to push back. She cleared her throat and attempted to clarify, though the arrogance in her tone remained. "Well, what I mean is, you weren't born here. You are a first-generation American. Many of your husband's supporters are skeptical about immigrants and their place in America. Doesn't that create a conflict?" The room was still. Everyone knew this wasn't just a question about immigration. It was a loaded attack, a barely disguised attempt to question Usha's Americanness, to paint her as an outsider, as someone who didn't truly belong. Usha tilted her head slightly and smiled. But her eyes? Her eyes were steel. "Let me tell you a story," she said, her voice steady. The journalist's smirk lingered, but Usha Vance's poised demeanor remained unshaken. She tapped the microphone lightly before speaking again, her voice filling the room with a quiet authority. "My mother, a young woman from India, arrived in the United States with nothing but 2 suitcases and a dream. She studied late into the night while working jobs that most people never notice. Cleaning offices, waiting tables, anything to make ends meet. My father, a man of discipline and determination, served this country in ways that went unnoticed. He worked, sacrificed, and never once questioned if he belonged, because he knew that America is a land where you don't ask for permission to belong. You earn it." The room was deathly silent, every journalist hanging on to her words. Some of them, particularly those on the liberal side, were still waiting for an opening. Some moment of weakness, some hesitation. But none came. Usha continued, her voice unwavering. "I was born here. I was raised here. I studied here. I worked my way into the highest ranks of law because I believed in the very thing that makes this country great, merit. I never needed anyone to tell me whether I belonged, because America is not a place where someone decides that for you." She paused, then fixed her gaze directly on the journalist who had asked the question. "But let's talk about what you just did." A ripple of tension spread through the crowd. The journalist blinked, clearly caught off guard. She hadn't expected Usha to go on the offensive. "You framed your question in a way that suggests that I am somehow less American because of my ancestry. You implied that my marriage to J.D. Vance is at odds with who I am, as if I should not, by default, align with conservative values, as if my background should dictate my beliefs. Do you realize what that says about you?" Murmurs spread through the audience. Cameras zoomed in, capturing every flicker of emotion on the journalist's face. First defiance, then uncertainty. Usha continued, her voice now sharper. "The irony is that you, a self-proclaimed progressive journalist, are engaging in the very thing you claim to fight against: discrimination. You are reducing me to an identity, a label. But America is not about labels. It is about principles." The journalist opened her mouth to interject, but Usha wasn't finished. You asked if I feel out of place in this administration, as if my skin color or my heritage should dictate my political views. But let me ask you something. Would you have asked the same question to an immigrant woman who supports the other side of the political aisle? Would you have questioned her Americanness? Or does your tolerance only extend to those who think exactly like you? A few reporters shifted in their seats, sensing the weight of the moment. Some nodded subtly, acknowledging the truth in her words. Others looked down at their notes, uncertain how to respond. And then, Usha delivered the final blow. The real problem isn't that I am an immigrant or the daughter of immigrants. The problem is that I challenge your narrative. And that makes you uncomfortable. A heavy silence settled over the room. No one knew what to say. The journalist swallowed hard, clearly rattled. She had walked into the press conference expecting to make headlines, just not like this. But Usha wasn't done. She straightened her shoulders, her voice calm once more. This country was built by people like my parents. By people who worked hard, who believed in American values, who refused to let others define them. That is the America I stand for. That is the America my husband and I fight for. The room remained still. No one interrupted. No one dared. Then Usha offered one final, graceful smile. Now she said, her tone light but resolute. Are there any real questions? A wave of hushed conversations broke out across the room as reporters scrambled to recover. But the journalist who had asked the question? She sat there, quiet, her arrogance shattered. And just like that, the media's rudeness had been exposed for what it truly was. The moment lingered like a storm cloud over the room. No one spoke immediately, as if the collective breath of the media had been knocked out of them. The journalist who had launched the attack sat stiffly, her hands gripping the notepad in front of her. But she did not speak. Usha Vance waited. She wasn't flustered. She wasn't angry. She simply observed, letting the weight of her words settle over the crowd. Then, slowly, another journalist stood up. This one was from a different network, known for covering politics with a more neutral stance. He cleared his throat. But the public wasn't buying it. Conservative outlets, on the other hand, were ecstatic. One primetime host opened his segment that night with a replay of the moment. The so-called progressive media just got exposed on live television, and I've got to say it was beautiful. Clips of Usha's response flooded TikTok and Instagram. Even users who didn't typically follow politics weighed in. Real Patriot 74, I don't care if you're left or right, this was a masterclass in handling the media. Respect. Liberal Dove 23, I don't even like J.D. Vance, but damn, that was a terrible question and Usha shut it down. Immigrant Strong, this is what being American is all about. Usha just set the record straight. The response was overwhelming. And then, late that night, Usha Vance's team received an unexpected call. It was from the White House. Usha Vance sat in her home office, a cup of chamomile tea untouched beside her. The past few hours had been a whirlwind, her phone buzzing nonstop, messages from colleagues, friends, and even strangers pouring in. Some praised her response, others criticized it, but one thing was certain, everyone was talking about her. The video of her exchange with the journalist had gone viral, crossing political divides in a way few moments ever did. Even those who disagreed with her politically admitted that the question had been loaded and her response had been nothing short of surgical. Then her phone rang again. She glanced at the caller ID. White House Chief of Staff. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. She exhaled and answered. Good evening, she said calmly. Mrs. Vance, came the familiar voice of the Chief of Staff, a seasoned political operative who had worked closely with her husband. The Vice President just finished a meeting and we wanted to reach out. Usha leaned back in her chair. I assume this is about the press conference. A chuckle on the other end. You assume correctly. There was a pause, then the Chief of Staff continued. Look, we all know the media was going to come after you at some point, but I don't think anyone expected them to hand you such an easy win. I don't consider it a win, Usha said, her voice steady. I consider it a reminder. A reminder of how certain people, especially those who claim to fight for inclusivity, still judge others based on their background when it suits them. Well, whatever you call it, the Vice President wanted me to tell you that he's proud of how you handled it. Usha smiled softly. Tell him I appreciate that. There's one more thing, the Chief of Staff added, his voice turning slightly more serious. The President saw the exchange too. He thinks this moment is bigger than just a media spat. He wants to discuss how we can channel this energy into something larger. Something that reinforces the idea of what America truly stands for. Usha was silent for a moment, considering. Then she said, I'm listening. Meanwhile, at the network headquarters, across town, inside the glass walls of a major news network, the journalist who had confronted Usha sat in a conference room, her face pale as she watched the fallout unfold on the screens around her. Producers were talking in hushed tones. Analysts were dissecting her question, and not in a flattering way. "Did you mean to phrase it like that?" one of her colleagues asked. The journalist sighed, rubbing her temples. "I didn't think it would blow up like this." "Well, it did," her producer said sharply. "And now half the country thinks you just tried to tell a sitting vice president's wife that she isn't American enough." "That's not what I meant," the journalist snapped. "Doesn't matter," the producer shot back. "Because that's how it looked." The journalist leaned back, frustration written all over her face. She had been in the game long enough to know that the media rarely forgave blunders like this. She had tried to make Usha Vance stumble, but instead, she had handed her a defining moment, one that would likely be remembered for years. And worse, she had exposed a truth about the media that many had long suspected but few had been able to articulate so clearly. The following morning, America woke up to a political and cultural firestorm. News outlets, pundits, and social media users continued dissecting the moment, debating its significance. Some doubled down, defending the journalist's question, arguing that it was a fair critique of conservative immigrant narratives. But many others, on both sides of the aisle, saw it differently. Usha Vance had not just defended herself. She had exposed a hypocrisy that many had grown weary of. The idea that certain immigrants were only celebrated when they fit a particular political mold was something many Americans had sensed but rarely heard articulated so clearly, and certainly not so powerfully. By noon, multiple networks had requested interviews with Usha. Some wanted to press her further, hoping to catch her off guard. Others simply wanted her to speak, knowing that whatever she said would draw massive viewership. She declined them all. Instead, she issued a short, composed statement through her team. "America is not a country of labels. It is a country of opportunity. I will always stand for an America that values people for their work, their character, and their contribution, not their ancestry. We can have political differences, but we should never question who belongs. Because if we start deciding who belongs based on ideology, we have already lost what makes this country great." The statement spread just as fast as the original moment. Even those who had initially criticized her found themselves respecting the response. That evening, as Usha sat in the living room of the vice president's residence, J.D. Vance walked in, a grin tugging at his lips. "Well," he said, tossing his phone onto the coffee table, "you broke the internet." Usha smirked, taking a sip of her tea. "I just told the truth." J.D. sat beside her, shaking his head. "It's funny," he mused. "They tried to corner you, and instead they handed you a moment that will probably be remembered for years." Usha shrugged. "People are tired of double standards. I just said what needed to be said." J.D. leaned in, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "And you did it better than any politician ever could." For a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of the past 24 hours settling in. Then J.D. chuckled. "You know, this might actually be the start of something bigger for you." Usha raised an eyebrow. "Oh." J.D. grinned. "Don't be surprised if people start asking when you are running for office." Usha laughed, shaking her head. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves." But deep down, she knew one thing for certain: this moment had changed everything. And it was only the beginning.